time, of course, 9/11 had already reminded us of the cliché of the global village, because it proved that we're living in a village in which a fire that started in a dusty cave somewhere in Afghanistan, in one corner of the global village, could be strong enough to melt the steel girders holding up the tallest skyscrapers at the opposite end of the global village. We have to recognize both the positive and the negative forces of the world today, and from it, a consciousness, distill a consciousness of the increasing mutual interdependence that characterizes our age. Global governance therefore rests on the realization that security is not indeed just about threats from enemy states or hostile powers, but that there are common phenomena that really cut across borders and affect us all. In fact, in my days in the UN, we used to use the phrase, problems without passports. The notion that the world is full of problems that cross all frontiers, that cannot be solved by any one country or any one group of countries, however rich or powerful they may be, and which are unavoidably the shared responsibility of humankind. This idea has gained strong ground through the 90s and through the first part of this century. There's an obvious list of such problems. Terrorism itself, the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, of the degradation of our common environment, of climate change, quite obviously because you can't put up a fence in the sky to sequester our own climate, which affects everyone. Persistent poverty and haunting hunger, human rights and human wrongs, mass illiteracy and massive displacement. There are financial and economic crises, because the financial contagion became a virus that spread from one country to others. The risk of trade protectionism, refugee movements, drug trafficking, and we must not overlook epidemic disease. Take the SARS epidemic in China. Initially there was an attempt to keep it quiet, but it was very easy for the virus to hop on a plane and show up in Toronto, and suddenly it became a global phenomenon, no longer something that could be contained in any one country. And the same was true earlier of AIDS, and later of swine flu, H1N1 today, and so on. So today, whether one is from India or from Indiana, whether you live in Narita or in Noida, it is simply not realistic to think only in terms of one's own country. Global forces press in from every conceivable direction. People, goods and ideas cross borders and cover vast distances with ever greater frequency, speed and ease. The internet is emblematic of an era in which what happens in New York or New Caledonia, from democratic advances to deforestation to the fight against AIDS, can affect lives here in New Delhi. As has been observed about water pollution, we all live downstream. Indians therefore have a growing stake in international developments. To put it another way, the food we grow and we eat, the air we breathe, and our health, security, prosperity and quality of life are increasingly affected by what happens beyond our borders. And that means we can simply no longer afford to be indifferent about the rest of the world, however distant other countries may appear. The fourth aspect is the emergence of institutions and processes that reflect this reality of increasing global convergence. Global institutions benefit from the legitimacy that comes from their universality. Since all countries belong to it, the UN enjoys a standing in the eyes of the world that gives its collective actions and decisions a legitimacy that no individual government can enjoy beyond its own borders. But the institutions of global governance have been expanding beyond the UN itself. There are selective intergovernmental mechanisms like the G8, military alliances like NATO, sub-regional groupings like the Economic Community of West African States, one-issue alliances like the Nuclear Suppliers Group. Writers connect under International PEN, soccer players in FIFA, athletes under the International Olympic Committee, mayors in the World Organization of United Cities and Local Governments. Bankers listen to the Bank of International Settlements, and businessmen to the International Accounting Standards Board. The process of regulating human activity above and beyond national boundaries has never been more widespread. Now this is occurring at a time when we have this huge list of problems with our passports that I talked about that also call for solutions that cross frontiers. Now individual countries may prefer not to deal with such problems directly or alone, but they're obviously impossible to ignore. So handling them together internationally is the obvious way of ensuring they are tackled. It's also the only way. Perhaps we can call for blueprints without borders. Some scholars of international affairs have begun to speak of an idea that they call responsible sovereignty, the notion that nations must cooperate across borders to safeguard common resources and to tackle common threats. I think that's a very sensible and succinct way of looking at the world which we have now come to, 65 years after the institutions of global governance were created, in a very different world, and in itself in a reaction to the very different world that preceded it. Now, in parallel is emerging the idea that there are universally applicable norms that underpin our notion of world order. Sovereignty is one, and linked to that idea is the principle of non-interference in other countries' internal affairs, equality and mutual benefit, non-aggression and coexistence across different political systems, the very principles first articulated by Pandit Nehru in his famous Panchsheel doctrine for the People's Republic of China in 1954. Today's China's foreign policy is not explicit about Panchsheel, but its principles are embedded in the Chinese concept of a harmonious world. Now, at the same time, there's evolved a new set of global norms of governance that complement these principles, including respect for human rights,